colleague. Thank you for hitting that, Ashley. I would like to thank my colleague, Shanidra Barnes, for all her help in setting up this panel. The grad school is a great collaborator with the Honors College. All right, as we go along, if you think of any question that you would like to have asked, then go ahead and put that in the chat, and at an appropriate time, we'll go ahead and help you get an answer to your question. All right, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers tonight, our panelists. Our first panelist is Catherine Sargent, Katie Sargent. Can you wave or say hello so people can see you? Thank you. Ms. Sargent was born and raised in Hot Springs, Arkansas. She graduated here at the top of her class from the University of Arkansas in 2017, earning her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology. She took, it looks like a gap year, which some of you may have a question about, working for the Arkansas Archaeological Survey and as a field technician for a private CRM firm. She began her graduate career at George Mason University, and she's just graduated last year with a Master of Arts in Anthropology and is now pursuing a PhD in anthropology at Arizona State. So she has 2 experiences with graduate school, so that makes her a good panelist for us. Our next panelist is Kayla Ford. Kayla, can you say hello?
Hey everyone, thanks for
Well, thanks for coming. Kayla is at the graduate school here. She graduated from the University of South Carolina in 2018. She also took a gap year, so that's interesting, before starting graduate school. Currently, she's a second-year PhD student in the clinical psychology program. Her research focuses on prevention of interpersonal violence through bystander intervention, and also factors that increase and mitigate risk of alcohol use. Our next panelist, Dr. Peter McGee, if you could say hello.
Hi, everybody.
Is Associate Professor of Economics in the Sam Walton College of Business here at the University of Arkansas. He received his MA and PhD, both in economics from Ohio State and his BS at Tulane. He's currently the Director of Graduate Studies for the MA and PhD programs. Our next panelist is Dr. Casey Harris. Can you say hello?
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. Dr. Harris is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Sociology and Criminology. So thank you all for coming. And I thought what we would do is start by hearing from Ms. Sargent and Ms. Ford about their experiences, what helped them make decisions along the way and why they chose the programs that they did. So would you mind starting, Ms. Sargent?
Sure, no pressure, right?
Okay.
So the question is, what sort of drew me to the particular programs that I wound up applying for?
Yeah, or just give us sort of a brief synopsis of the decisions that you made to first pick the program at George Mason and then Arizona State. Why'd you go to graduate school at all?
Okay, all right. So firstly, I did take a gap year. That wasn't intentional. I actually applied to grad school right after undergrad, but didn't get into where I wanted to go. So that was a major sort of factor in my decision making, right? I have always known that I wanted to go to grad school. It's not something that you just sort of decide on a whim. I don't think you really have to have a very strong passion for what you're doing. So that's kind of gonna guide most of the decisions you're gonna make So really what you're interested in. Figuring out where I would wind up going. Like I said, I applied and then didn't get into where I wanted to go the first time. That time around, I really didn't know exactly what path I wanted to pursue. I was sort of torn between several different options. And so I didn't have as strong of an application as I could have because of that, right? The second time around, I had more time to reflect on what I was really interested in and what I wanted to do, right? Which wound up being bioarchaeology in South America, right? So that sort of narrowed it down a bit. I remember looking at basically doing a Google search for bioarchaeologist, Peru, universities, right? And that sort of got the ball rolling as far as figuring out who is doing what I was interested in. I wound up at George Mason because of my advisor there. He was the only reason I wound up going there. I mean, it's a good school too, of course, that factors in, but really your advisor is going to be the most important one. Same thing happened here, right? Again, with the Google search. Again, with I am at Arizona State because of my advisor, because she does what I want to do and is actually like one of my sort of academic heroes, right? So for me, it's been kind of bumbling along and figuring it out as I go.
Perfect. Thank you. How about you, Ms. Ford?
Yeah, so I don't even know where to start, I guess. It took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do as well. I started off in like nursing, and then I transitioned exercise science, and then ended up really liking research and learning more about the mental health aspect of it. And so from there, I decided to switch over to psychology. And so I feel like for me, the decision to go to grad school came from like talking to mentors and researching different kinds of programs on my own, and then just figuring out like what are the things that are important to me, what stands out about these different programs, and then just kind of narrowing it down based on the interests I had developed through research and some of the exposure I had to clinical work. So yeah, I feel like for me, it was a lot of like mentorship and just kind of like getting that advice on, you know, what kind of career path and education do I have to have in order to obtain like the career that I want in the end. And so I feel like that really helped me figure out my best options kind of going forward. So I landed on the PhD route just because I felt like I wanted to be an evidence-based clinician and also conduct my own research, because I also really like the idea of disseminating it to make it more like mainstream for people to access. So that's what drew me to a PhD as opposed to like a master's based program where it's more clinical focused and not as much of the research training. But yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions. I don't know if that really answered it, but mainly mentorship was really helpful for me in deciding.
Well, and that kind of kicks off my first question that perhaps our faculty members here could help us with too. How do you, why should you go to grad school in some of these fields? And also, why shouldn't you go? Who wants it? Dr. McGee.
Can I start off just a little bit?
Yeah.
So Katie's advice is really apt, which is you have to go because you want to do it. Too often I've seen in PhD programs in economics, students who are good at it as undergrads who just keep going because they were good at it. And it's not quite the same. I mean, it's a job when you get to graduate school and you have to treat it as such. And the material amps up in technical rigor and it's geared towards independent work. So you can't do it to do assignments, to treat it like it's classwork, it's professional development. So I think that was a really great piece of advice because that's exactly what I tell students. Why should you go to graduate school? Well, I think it's going to depend a bit from field to field. I mean, for economists, generally speaking, there are roles that will only be filled with people who have acquired the skills in a PhD program, a lot of the technical skills for banks and central banks and public policy positions. But we generally try and sell people on the research route. And this is something where you will make slightly less money than if you went into a private sector job, but it's what we refer to as compensating differentials. You know, I have a lot of freedom over my time. I don't have a boss in any particular sense. I have a lot of freedom over what I do, over my agenda, what I get to do from day to day. And I can tell you that when I applied to graduate school, it was because I'd been an unserious undergraduate and then had a job I absolutely hated. And at that point, I decided I wanted to have some say in what I got to do. So I'll stop talking and let somebody else chime in.
I could certainly follow up on that. I think the advice that our graduate student panelist delivered, I think, was very apt as well, which is, having a passion for the topic. Much like Dr. McGee, I think a lot of our students, in some cases, come in thinking that they're really good at what they do. And even they have a general sense of passion, but I would even go so far as to say, graduate school encourages you in a lot of ways to think about the specific areas within a very large field that you're really, truly interested in. In a lot of ways, our training forces you down that path to kind of figure out where it is that you fit. In terms of why going to graduate school, much like Dr. McGee said, I think a lot of our students see some benefits. So we're a master's only program, and I can talk a little bit about the PhD side of things, which is a route that I pursued myself, of course. I, in particular, also had a job that I did not like. I worked at the FBI, as a matter of fact, which may seem really attractive, but it was not exactly what I thought it was going to be. And I realized that the skill sets that I really wanted to develop and what I was interested in doing were only going to be filled by going to a PhD program, to pursuing more education. But there are still some advantages even for our students to go to a master's program in our discipline. A lot of the jobs that people do that are higher level, higher order jobs in terms of data analytics, a lot of our demography oriented students get to work more with policy advocacy in ways that you would not get if you were an undergraduate. It doesn't mean necessarily that you won't have some exposure to that, but really being a generator of knowledge at the master's and PhD level requires, to be a generator of knowledge in our discipline requires a master's or a PhD. And that means all of the jobs within either the nonprofit, the governmental sector, or even in the private sector that utilize those social science skills to produce new things or advocate on behalf of new things really are restricted to those who get a graduate degree of some kind.
Right. Ms. Sargent, Ms. Ford, do you want to add anything to that? You can say no. Or Ms. Barnes, just from the general grad school perspective, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, what I have found and what I've seen is spot on to what both Dr. Harris and Dr. McGee have said. I've spoke to so many individuals to whom took that gap year off or went and got a master's, but was in a career that they thought that's what they wanted to do. But upon getting into it and being in it for a couple of years, they decided they needed to go back to school, either to fulfill what they are truly passionate about, or to gain some additional expertise in an area to get that promotion, or to get that next level job, or to get that new career that they're searching for. So oftentimes graduate school is really truly that in-between stage. I actually spoke with a student earlier today who was just saying, I'm looking at my options. Graduate school is an option, but also starting a job is an option. And what I told her, my advice would be, when you're looking at graduate schools, be it here at the University of Arkansas, because we definitely want you here, but if there's other places, look and ask about assistantships, because oftentimes you're able to fulfill both of those getting that higher degree, but then also having that work experience as well through an assistantship, be it a general assistantship or teaching assistantship or even a research assistantship, because ultimately you're getting paid to go to school. And that's kind of fulfilling both of those things that oftentimes undergrads have, because they're tired of school. It's like, I don't want to go to school. I'm getting my degree. That's what I've been tasked to do, and I'm done. But oftentimes getting into those graduate programs, be it a master's program or a PhD program, you're actually getting that hands-on experience, as well as extra education and extra knowledge to get up those ladders that you're trying to get to.
And we'll circle back around to that funding question in just a moment too. So the next question I want to move on to was, so you've decided that you're going to go to grad school. How do you select the program or the school? What steps do you need to do to make this selection?
I guess I can jump in on this one, actually. I think, a lot of the themes that have already been discussed about identifying fit and what you're interested in are extremely important, and also having in mind what your end goal is. What do you want to do, at least to some degree, once you attain this higher degree? I think in our field, for example, we have a lot of specialization, even within something like criminology, which is my area. Some programs are much more quantitative, others are more qualitative, and they cater to very different outcomes upon graduation. So becoming familiar with the kinds of research that you might be interested in, the kinds of topics that you want to study. Some of these disciplines are huge, and you need to kind of think more strategically about where do you see yourself, ending up when you complete this degree. And that also means thinking a little bit also about the culture of the places that you're going. I will say, I've had students that have asked me about applying to specific programs, and I may know some people there and say, that's not really the kind of place where I see you fitting in because of X, Y, and Z. And it may have nothing to do with the topic more generally, but maybe, the expectations for work, or the way that they run their cohorts, or, maybe it is substantive in some ways, that maybe the student's interest is in something that is a little bit further off the beaten path, and this program really kind of caters to something that's a little bit more mainstream. I think there's a lot of those kinds of decisions that I would encourage students to talk with their mentors about and utilize research experience while they're an undergraduate, or even, in the summer between, or if they're taking a gap year, for example. I did research in my gap year with faculty at my undergraduate university that was instrumental in reorienting me to what kinds of programs I should be looking at, given my own skill set, and ultimately what I wanted to do. And I think that a lot of those conversations happen with faculty, mentors.
So can I jump in?
Absolutely.
So I think one thing that's important to note is that, I've said you have to be really passionate. You have to follow your interests. You have to figure out who does what you're interested in doing and talk to them, right? Which seems to be sort of a general theme. But additionally, that doesn't mean you have to know exactly what you're going to do in grad school, what research you're going to pursue exactly. It's more of just a guideline than a strict rule, because if you go in just your heart set on one very particular thing, you may wind up being disappointed, and also be closing yourself off to other potential lines of, trajectories for your career and research, right? So I think that's important to note, to not get too freaked out about, like, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with my life. That's okay. That's what the master's is for, to an extent, at least when you're following the trajectory of master's to PhD. As Dr. Harris was talking about, one thing that I didn't really think about was departmental cultures. And that's really, really important to your experience, because you don't want to be miserable the entire time you're in grad school, right? How do you find out about departmental cultures? Because that's not really something that's advertised on the website, right? You need to talk to grad students who are currently at the university you're interested in. That can seem kind of scary, but I promise you, we are nice and we love talking to people, because talking to people means that we don't have to be doing the work that we're inevitably supposed to be doing right now. So yeah, talking to people is like the number way of figuring this stuff out. Talk to your potential advisors, talk to grad students who are currently there. Talk to other people who may not be exactly who you want to work with, but like you're still interested in. Just talk to everybody.
Anybody else want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so econ, I think, might work a little bit differently from some of the other programs. But one thing I always tell people is don't get a PhD in economics if what you want is an MBA, right? There are different sets of skills. And a lot of people think, well, it'll make me very attracted to industry. There are a lot of sort of terminal master's programs that are tailored to promoting skills that industry values. So for instance, we actually just started an MS in economic analytics that serves that role. Typically, we do MAs or master's degrees in the course of doing a PhD. So standalone master's degrees in economics aren't terribly common. When applying to a program, we don't have faculty-led funding models. So the funding for PhD students, which is what I'm mostly talking about, I can speak to MA programs, but lies with the department. So we give out funding, not particular faculty members. I mean, it's a little bit different in Europe and some other places, but at least in the US. And then in the first year of a PhD in econ, you'll just spend all your time doing core courses towards comprehensive exams. And most of the time, students don't have a good sense of what they want to do. So for a student like that, I always recommend bigger programs are better because they have wider field coverage. And you can sort of discover that in your second year of graduate school when you typically do field courses. If you're someone who has a very precise notion of what you want to do, sure, you apply to programs that are a little bit more specialized. But it's always a bit riskier if you're not really, really sure. And then, we have sort of rankings. And the other thing I will always tell students is go to the best graduate school you get into that's going to pay for you. Because in the end, the name on your degree will matter, whether it should or not, it will. And so that's another piece of advice. I mean, when it comes to department cultures, that's very hard to know. So definitely ask your faculty, not to name and shame, but there are a few places that are very top econ programs that are sort of notorious for saying, look, you get in, if you pass your comprehensive exams, we'll fund you after that. And that's just because they're sufficiently good that they can get away with that, but it tends to be kind of a cutthroat first year. And there are certain places that are just famous for it. So culture is very hard, but your faculty advisor or whomever will be able to help you with that.
I would add on to that just to say, when you're interviewing, because oftentimes for a graduate degree or program, you're going to have an interview. And as they're interviewing you, make sure that you're interviewing them. You're interviewing that institution, you're interviewing that department, because you do want to make sure that you're going to be, that they're going to be a good fit for you, not just you being a good fit for their program. And I think that speaks to kind of what Dr. McGee was saying. Know where you're going and understand kind of what their focus is as well.
All right. So what about the funding? Do you have any thoughts generally on that? Do you just apply, or what are the tricks to getting funding for your graduate education? Nobody wants that one.
I'll start with this one because I think we're actually quite simple. Because it's not faculty led, it's just a competitive pool. So, we will submit nominations for fellowships on the basis of GRE scores, GPAs, quantitative coursework, and the same for admission. When we admit students we have a limited number of fellowship, or excuse me, graduate assistantships, and we give those to the best sort of objective candidate. I mean, because we don't specialize very early, we don't focus on anything else. Although I will say that unless it's a really good program, don't ever pay your way in a PhD. There's probably somebody out there who will give you a fellowship, an assistantship, something, at least in econ. Again, I can't speak to the other fields.
It's very much the same way actually in our discipline as well. Maybe perhaps with the exception that we have a lot of federally funded research centers at a lot of universities that do have, it's soft money, but they're so large as research centers that they run on, $2-3 million per year budgets. And so we have PhD assistantship lines that typically run out of those as well. But the vast majority of our assistantships in our discipline are also departmentally funded. So when students are admitted, they're given typically to the best students. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things outside of GRE and GPA that don't matter for our discipline, and really kind of the social sciences more generally. And I think a couple of others could probably speak to this as well, which is getting research experience ahead of time. I know I'm teaching an intro class for the first time this semester, as a matter of fact, and already, I've shot my shot across the bow a couple of times with my students that they need to, if they are intending to go on for higher education, start thinking even in their freshman, sophomore years about what that will look like in the context of the degree that they want to ultimately attain, because competitiveness for funding in our field is quite high. The social sciences are a little bit more underfunded, I think, than a lot of the hard science labs are more typically. And so funding can be quite competitive. But like Dr. McGee said, there are most programs nowadays fully fund their PhD students. In fact, it's not uncommon for bachelor students that go straight into quote unquote PhD programs on a 5 or 6 year track for our field to have that funding guaranteed up front, as a matter of fact. And so it's not a cutthroat kind of environment, although there are still places that do the ranking game on a yearly basis, for something survivor style. And that doesn't typically bode well. And I kind of encourage students, much like he does, to think really hard about whether that's the kind of place you really want to go.
So I will say Arizona State is such a place. We have a ranking system that determines funding. So normally speaking, on a normal year that's not this year, everybody gets funding. Somehow, somewhere they make it happen. They're historically very good at that. But funding has been drastically impacted by the pandemic, right? So I have at least one member of my cohort I know who has no funding this year because it just didn't exist because of COVID related stuff. So to people who are considering applying for soon, bear that in mind, because I don't see social sciences recovering super quickly in that regards, because like both Dr. Harrison and Dr. McGee have said, we have a funding problem in general as a discipline or as a larger field.
I know for the programs that I was applying to, a lot of them actually had information on the websites about how funding would work and how long you were guaranteed funding, and then what sort of position you might have if you were accepted. And so otherwise, I definitely agree with everything everyone else has already said too, but just as far as finding that information, looking on websites can be really helpful. Because it can be intimidating to ask about in interviews. I know in some of mine, it kind of naturally came up, but I got mixed feedback on whether or not to directly ask. So I'd recommend definitely checking out websites for the programs you're interested in.
Great, thank you. All right, how about undergraduates always want to know, how do they prepare a competitive application? Anybody?
I guess I can jump in here. I think it is probably a little bit more field specific in this particular type of answer. But there are some very obvious things that I think sometimes students get mixed messages about that most programs probably end up looking at. I think in my discipline, in the social sciences more generally, there's been more of a move towards holistic applications. So we do care about each of those pieces. I think sometimes students get hung up on, for example, GRE or GPA alone, when in fact, we're sort of trying to triangulate data points across different criteria. But those things do matter. A good application packet is a student who can show consistently strong performance in a number of different areas, right? So whether that's GRE, either one component of the GRE or whatever their standardized exam is, right? GMAT or LSAT as well. That also is supported by a strong GPA, especially in their upper level courses or in some specific courses that may highlight the sort of strengths that the program that they're applying to. So my own students typically are trained in quantitative methods, and they go to quantitative PhD programs, and I tell them that their upper level statistics courses matter a lot, the kinds of performance that they have in those. And then at the same time, I'll reiterate again, and I cannot stress this enough, having experience with actual faculty projects in a lot of cases is the number one thing that they can do. Our department has been quite successful using our research centers to get students involved with research internships, even as undergraduates. In many cases, they're on publications before they even leave their bachelor's programs. That is a huge deal when they're applying to a PhD or an MA program, because those programs are looking for applicants who they're trying to project success. And if you can already do what you're going to be expected to do when you're in those programs and show evidence of that, at least in a junior capacity, that's a real strength for people in our field. And so research experience is probably the number one criteria that I would say students should be pursuing.
Great.
So we have some overlap with what you just said, which is that when we evaluate an applicant, we typically look for quantitative skills because it's easier for us on average to find sort of economic intuition in students who have taken economics courses, but the level of rigor, the tools that we use jump dramatically. And so we, getting straight A's in econ classes is great, but I often joke you should just be a math major because we're going to look at your computer science courses, your engineering courses, your statistics courses, your pure math courses. So if you're interested in a graduate field, make sure you go and look now at what's important, because I've had students recently who wanted to do PhDs in econ who hadn't gone past like Calc 2, right? Which is fine. I mean, it's not like they were bad math students, but they just hadn't taken enough. And so we had somebody who's in a PhD program now at Carnegie Mellon who graduated from Arkansas last year, I guess, who stayed an extra semester to take some math. For us, undergraduate research is less common, but on this, to the same end, it's very important to get to know faculty members because we can smell a generic letter, right? Because we have very few signals that we're going to use to admit you, and those are going to be your GRE, your quantitative math, your quantitative coursework, and then your letters. And somebody who has a letter that really speaks to this person's good and they'll be good in graduate school for X and Y reason, that speaks a lot more than they were in my class, they got an A, they seemed nice. We can smell that. I should also point out that we don't care a ton about the GRE writing and the GRE verbal. That's not to say we don't care about them at all, right? But there's a bottom threshold. And part of that is that you have lots of international applicants. So as long as you can speak English, we're not terribly concerned. I mean, that's definitely a problem if you're too far below, but if you're going to focus on one area of the exam, the verbal is not the place to go if you're going to do econ. I mean, that's definitely the last thing we sort of look at.
Ms. Sargent, you said that your application improved. You took the year, and so what did you do to improve it over that year?
So, okay, it's been a minute, so I'm thinking back. So number one, actually, just while I'm thinking about it before I move on there, I only took the GRE once, and it didn't get me in the first time around. It got me in the second time around. What changed? Everything else around the GRE changed. So it is a factor, but it's like they've been saying, it's not the biggest one. You can get in with solidly average math scores like me. So what did I do to improve the application the second time around? I actually went and talked with a member of the Honors College staff whose name I can no longer remember, and I am so sorry to him. He was wonderful. But he really sat down with me and helped me figure out sort of what colleges were looking for and which of my strengths I should put the most emphasis on, right? Because I was still in the mindset of applying for undergrad, where you have like a nice little anecdote to start your like application essay with, of like how you, I don't know, fell and broke your leg one time as a kid and then it got better and you got stronger or whatever. That's not going to fly so much for grad school. You really need to be focusing more on passion and less on cute little anecdotes, because that's what people who are looking at applications are interested in. I think that's one of the things I did wrong the first time. I'm pretty sure I had a cutesy anecdote in there, which weakened my overall sort of application because of the shift in emphasis, if that makes sense. But yeah, mainly it was Mr. I don't even know if he's still at York Honors College, but talk to them. They're good people.
That was probably Jason Blankenship, who's left us, but hopefully we can follow in his stead.
We can help you. Yes, we can. Anybody else? Ms. Barnes, do you?
I just actually want to reiterate something that both Katie and Dr. McGee said that I actually think is also really important, which is, making your connections with faculty. A lot of the things that we're talking about doing early on, in terms of like your upper level courses and focusing on those, or in my case, when I was emphasizing becoming involved in research, is in fact to build up those relationships, not only for people to write you good letters, but also to help navigate. That's how you get good research mentors for PhD programs or for MA programs, I think, is to actually get to know the tenure track faculty, which is sometimes difficult to do. And in many cases, actually in my field, students don't even know the difference between our non-tenure track faculty and our tenure track faculty, and that they get very different letters and really help in navigating that next step when they are engaging those two different groups. And students often need to be told, even in their senior year, that there is in fact a very distinct difference, and engaging with one group is sometimes more advantageous for certain types of outcomes than others.
This is a problem across the U of A, and something we've been trying to do: more education, make students educated consumers of their professors.
Yes, Dr. Harris took all of the words that I was about to say. Building those relationships, relationship building is key. The university system, you may think, oh, we're just in Fayetteville, Arkansas. It's not that big. It's not a playing field that people don't know each other. And oftentimes you'll have faculty from different institutions that are friends of your faculty, your professors. They may have went to school together. They may have went to a conference together, and they talk. They have conversations. They talk about not just their research or their classes. They talk about students as well. So building those relationships with your faculty, and even just faculty across the university, helps, because one, it teaches you how to have conversations with individuals you feel that are in authority of you, or higher positions than you, or older than you. It helps you navigate that, so that when you're outside of the University of Arkansas, you're able to have those conversations comfortably. But then also it helps you, to Dr. Harris's point, navigate from a research standpoint, from a university standpoint, to Dr. McGee's, point of, some universities are a little bit more tight as far as funding and very rigid. Relationships help you navigate through those waters. So I would say definitely build relationships. because I can't speak to you. I can give a generic letter, but if I know you past just class, past the fact that you sit on the third row in the second seat, if I know you a little bit better than that, the letter that I write is going to be a little bit more meaningful. And therefore, it's going to come across a little bit more meaningful.
And I think this is something, there are freshmen and sophomores on the call as well. It's something that students struggle with because they don't want to bother faculty, right? So we're constantly saying, and we'll say it here, you're not bothering people. Like going to office hours is a good junior step for this, right? Go to office hours, ask questions during class, engage the material, develop relationships, and then the honors thesis, right? By the time you develop that relationship, that person should be a great person to give you the letters, as Dr. Harris suggested, and so forth, right? So there are steps that you can begin to take as early as a freshman to develop these relationships. So go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say on the subject of relationships that yes, agreed with everything just said. I just want to. So I remember when I was an undergrad, a lot of people would be telling me that relationships are important and ask people questions and talk to them, right? And I always struggled with like, how do I actually go about doing that, right? Beyond just asking questions. Because I personally, when I'm like, I need to ask a question to get to know these people, my mind is blank. I have no questions. As somebody who has office hours myself, I really don't mind if people just show up and start talking to me about, I don't know, the latest movie that's out or whatever. Like, please just come talk to us about literally anything. Like, I have no one show up to my office hours. I would just be happy to see another human being, right? That's how I made my relationship in part with my master's advisor, is I just crash in his office sometimes and talk to him about literally anything. It didn't have to be some question about, the meaning of life or how to cure cancer or what have you, right? So it's okay to just talk to professors as human beings too, beyond just the profession.
Great point. Yeah. Students will often say to me, well, I don't want to bother you, but, and this is in the office hours. Well, this is my job. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you, but this is part of the job. Okay, so we're coming to, I do want to open it up for questions, but is there anything else that any of the panelists think that we need to put out generally as part of our content before any sort of final comments before questions? Nope. All right, so we hit the highlights, yay. Okay, what questions do we have out in the crowd? No question is, if you're thinking it, somebody else is thinking it, and you can put it in the chat.
I had a question.
Please.
I just wanted to hear y'all's opinion on whether or not applying for grad school during this pandemic seems like a good idea. I just feel like even right now, my education feels like it's being impacted by this pandemic. And I know everyone's doing the best they can, so I'm very appreciative for everything, but I'm just a little nervous because my original plan was to apply right after I had graduated with my bachelor's, but now I'm a little more apprehensive.
There isn't a simple answer to that question, unfortunately. I've been in grad school both in and out of the pandemic. It is 100,000% more difficult during the pandemic. My quality of education is not as good. It just can't be, right? But at the same time, you've got to, so in an ideal world where the pandemic somehow still existed, honestly, probably no, because it's harder. But you've also got to take into consideration, what are you going to do that's not grad school during a pandemic, because literally nothing is easy right now. And it's going to be incredibly difficult to find a job right now, too. So you could either be furthering your future goals and struggling, or you can be trying to find a job in a horrible, horrible job market and struggling. There's just no win here. I'm sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some clearly disadvantages to going to graduate school during a pandemic. I mean, I know our current graduate cohort feels very different about their education than the cohort that is now in our second year of our master's program even. It's night and day in terms of their level of bonding, their level of sort of classroom engagement, even research productivity with faculty, right? They're not in the classroom, so they're not getting that much that mentorship to the same degree. However, first of all, I don't think the pandemic is going to last forever. So in a lot of cases, we're projecting a timeline that nobody is entirely sure about. It is going to make it more competitive, at least in the short term. There is, at least in our discipline, and I think others on this call can probably speak to the other fields, but it is going to make it more competitive. But at the same time, I would echo what Katie is saying, that we're finding competitiveness across the board has increased, that as budgets in a lot of different places have been constrained, that our NGO partners, our governmental agencies, our private corporate connections that have hired in recent years, they're all feeling the same kinds of constraints. And so, students at all levels are experiencing a very different job market, whether that be academic or not. And so, I'm not sure I could say don't apply or do apply. A lot of it will depend on your specific field and what impact the pandemic has had on budgets within that area, and subsequently all those different programs. But at the same time, there's a lot of other moving parts to that decision.
Thank you. Oh, Kayla, did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just thinking some things to maybe consider in that decision. I don't think there's an easy answer, but maybe even thinking about like your style of learning and like, do you learn better in person? Have online classes gone well for you before when you've had them? So I came in originally having a semester at the U of A, and then now I've been not at the U of A since. And so it was definitely an adjustment, but I think depending on like the program's culture, it can also really help with that. And then kind of as other panelists have pointed out too, like considering the social kind of aspect of school, grad school can be really intense. And so kind of thinking about what kind of support network you have within the context of this pandemic could be helpful in like deciding if now would be a good time for you to actually start a program like that.
Good advice. I have a question from Nikki. Do gap years affect funding and access to those relationships with faculty? So generally, is a gap year a good idea, and how can it impact things?
For us, gap years are irrelevant. I mean, the only issue you might have is finding a professor who no longer remembers you, but that's getting back to make connections with your faculty, because routinely we have people who do something else first and come back. And as long as their profile looks good, we're not going to be concerned with what they did in the interim.
Yeah, I'd echo the same thing. It depends on what you use the gap year for, and it depends on those relationships that you've established prior to taking a gap year. So I spent part of my gap year working in government at the FBI, and then subsequently decided that I wanted to spend the rest of my gap year working on research back at my university that I had finished my degree at, and that time was well spent getting more exposure, getting some publications started. But we've had students in the past who've used their gap year and maybe not used it strategically, and that may have hurt them, removed them a little bit, I think, in terms of like when they've graduated. It depends on how it's being used, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yes, 100%. What I did, I wound up getting jobs in my field, which allowed me to make further connections and continue having the connections I made in undergrad. right? So that actually helped me because of what I did. But at the same time, I think there's an additional benefit to taking a gap year that has nothing to do with sort of the academic sphere. And that's sort of, at the risk of sounding cliche, working on yourself and really just figuring out who and what you want outside of school. That provides you with a much stronger basis as a person to be able to cope with grad school. So for me, the risk of potentially losing connections, because I didn't know I was going to get a job in my field, sort of was counteracted by the fact that I had that time to sort of decompress and figure out what life was like outside of school. Because, you know, we're in school from pretty much the moment like we turn like 5 or 6, depending on where you are, to 20, whatever, depending. So.
Some mechanical questions about the GRE. What is it? When should I take it? What does it cost? Anyone want to talk to that? Ms. Barnes, you may be the most qualified for that. It is the graduate record examination, if I'm not misspeaking.
Yes, it is. The best way that I explain it to undergrads is it's kind of like the ACTSAT, because that's the one test that they have had experience with, and they have to take that in order to get into, you know, an undergrad program. So it's the same premise, but a little bit more intense. And oftentimes you take either the GRE or the GMAT, depending on, you know, where you're going to school, what they require, pretty much kind of like the ACT and the SAT. Prior to the pandemic, I would say maybe 3 or so years before that, the GRE was, I would say, probably the top thing that graduate schools looked at besides your GPA to get into a program. There's been research that has been done that still stands. You need that GRE, but there's also research that says students are capable of being very productive in a graduate program minus the GRE. And going through this pandemic, we have kind of, it's pushed a lot of institutions to look at the data stating the GRE may not necessarily be an indicator of how well a student will do. With that being said, a lot of institutions are still relying on that data to see how well you'll perform in a graduate program. The cost, I do not want to quote the cost. It's a couple of $100, if I'm not mistaken. I want to say 200, but that's give or take a little bit. There are courses and materials to help you kind of navigate through it, to learn what happens in the GRE, what tests, questions are like. It was years ago when I took it. And so I'm not sure if it's the same structure as it was many, many moons ago.
Dr. Harris says the GRE is currently $205, which seems like somebody's making money off some testing. But of course,
yes,
we're having this discussion all over the place, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the ACT, the SAT, but currently programs still require it, so it'll need to be taken. We have some. We have our own books at the Honors College if you want to check out some GRE books and so forth. And and we can help you get information on that. So,
And I would say from a taking standpoint, and I would defer to Dr. Harris and Dr. McGee as well. I would say end of junior year, going into your senior year, especially if you're looking towards, if you're, you know, for sure you're going to graduate school. I would say, you know, take it in between that junior senior year, because it does take about 6 weeks for the test scores to come back. So if you're applying to graduate schools, you're going to need that if it's required for the application.
and Daniela asks about fee exemptions like there are for the ACT and SAT. I'm not sure.
Some programs.
Oh, Dr. Harris is on it. He's like the GRE
Yes.
researching guy. He's got a link
Thank
in there.
you.
Very good.
I do this for our students a lot, so we're good.
Yeah, so there you go.
Perfect. There are some programs that do offer exemptions for or offer a fee waiver for the GRE. You would definitely have to kind of just see what those programs are. And even some institutions will, if they want you and you've built that relationship, they may offer a waiver as well for that particular exam.
Thank you. All right, we're just about out of time. Any last question or thought? I don't see one. Well, thank all of you for coming and sharing this information and being available for our grad students. There's Dean Coon. She popped in.
Sorry, I couldn't get on at first. It's weird. I don't know what I did, but that was awesome. And what a great crowd. So thanks to the presenters, to Louise for organizing, and yeah, really, that was impressive.
All right, well, thanks all of you. Enjoy the rest of your night. And if there's anything we can help you with here in the Honors College, we can help follow up on some of your questions to do with the GRE. If you need help with grad school prep materials, we can help you with that. Anything you need, just get in touch with us and we are happy to help. All right, and thanks again to the grad school for helping out and all the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, guys.
Katie, thank you so much.